So, what about true anxiety? You mentioned earlier on that sometimes anxiety is a time to slow down and pause and tune in to what's driving this, what's really underneath it. So maybe you've kind of gotten your microbiome cleaned up, you've figured out whether there's hormonal aspects, you've gotten your sleep in a better space, and you're still feeling like anxious every day you go into your job. You're just like, oh, it makes me so anxious to go in this building. I can't stand it. Or maybe you're feeling anxious about your kids and worried about them chronically. So how do you start to identify true anxiety and how do you work with that with your patients?
And those are such good examples because, like, take the office one, for example. Culturally, if we're really honest with ourselves, what happens often is I feel so anxious every day that I walk into this job, and then I go see a primary care doctor and they give me Lexapro, and now I can tolerate this job.
Just a
And
half an Ativan can get me through
right.
it.
And
Yes.
so, I mean, I'll be the first to admit, like, we're not always in a position to extricate ourselves from inhumane working conditions. But I also don't want us to fully be in denial of it or unaware. We need to file away somewhere. This is a betrayal of my needs that I'm doing right now because I have to in this situation or because I choose to in this situation. But that true anxiety is there to communicate something very important. This job is out of alignment for you. Whether you're not valued, whether you're not treated well, whether it's unsustainable, whether you're burned out, something about the situation has to change. It doesn't always have to be that we quit our jobs. This is one of my favorite things
Mhm.
to do with patients. I have so many patients at a breaking point in their jobs, and they think it's either be burned out or quit. And there's this medium path, which is, well, what if we set the limits and applied the boundaries that would make this job sustainable? Can you lower your standards? Can you care a little bit less? Can you show up and do your reasonable best, but not your 1,000% effort best? And a lot of my patients find a path forward where they can stay in jobs that they generally liked, but that were just too much, just by adjusting their boundaries and their expectations on themselves. And people always are afraid that they're going to get fired. And so often we actually don't get fired. And in certain ways, sometimes we show up more creatively, more patiently, more kind when we're rested and whole and intact in that way. So I think that true anxiety was there as a communication. And it really has useful information that we can heed. And with the kids, like, I mean, it's really hard to be a kid in this world right now. And I think our true anxiety, there aren't easy answers with this, but we definitely need to slow down and attune to our children and help hold them through what's so impossible. And I think that true anxiety can sometimes be a call to action to really attune and not just see this as a problem, but in many ways see that our children are having an appropriate reaction to a really difficult circumstance.
What I see with anxiety is the behavioral component of is the tendency to avoid, right? So avoidance is what we would naturally do to something that is feared or hurtful in some way. And so we avoid and then the anxiety increases. So whether we're avoiding by disengaging at work, getting sick and not going in, or we're avoiding by doing things like taking that half an Ativan. But with parenting and with work, I actually have found with a lot of my clients, helping them hook into something that they can get engaged in
Hmm.
at their work or engaged in with their parenting gives them more agency around it. Like now all of a sudden I can take all that spinning energy that's spinning out and leading me to avoid and actually put it towards something that I care about here. So it's often this paradoxical thing. I think anxiety is quite a paradox because often the things that you think it isn't. And the things that you think you should do, you should probably do the opposite. And that's how you're going to find your way out of this conundrum. The other aspect of anxiety is that you have this really intense sense of self. And I've seen that with, for example, with what's happening with Ukraine. A lot of folks that are coming into my office, there's a portion of them that are very concerned about the Ukrainian people. The really anxious ones are, how is this going to impact me? And how is this going to impact my work? How is this going to impact my supply chain? How is this going to impact my kids? You know, that anxiety has this sense of self to it, where the self becomes the focus and the center. And some of the approaches that you talk about in the anatomy of anxiety are actually things that help you get a little bit of space from the self. So, two of the practices that you highlight are meditation and psychedelics. And interestingly, they're in the same chapter, which makes complete sense to me, but it may be helpful for folks to understand why would you put meditation and psychedelics in the same chapter, because I really think it relates to self and how they help you get a little perspective, both of them, that you aren't the center of everything.
This question that you're asking is actually so deep. Let's go there. I
Yeah.
think that, I mean, when we really boil down that anxiety instinct, it has to do with survival. It has to do with trying to prevent a worst case scenario of basically dying ourselves or losing the people that we love, or getting into a situation of suffering. And I think that let's first just honor that instinct, right? And so we're not bad people for having that instinct. But I think sometimes it lacks perspective. And in this weird way of the human experience, like we need a little bit of that egoic way of making sense of the world so that we'll work hard and make good choices and not cross the street in front of a truck. But I think it's also a little bit of an illusion. And and I think that meditation and psychedelics both give us that distance from what we identify in this really narrow way as the self. And in meditation, I always find it's like you can sit like a foot to the right of yourself and observe it and be like, oh, look at that sweet little silly crazy thing. And with psychedelics, it's really interesting the research that shows a quieting down of the default mode network in the brain, this part of our brain where we sort of hang out when we're not actively engaged in a task. And that's really geographically where we do our future tripping and our dwelling on the past. And it has so much to do with our narrow definition of the self. And when that quiets down in a psychedelic ceremony, it gives us this taste of dissolving the borders of our sense of ourself, and to feel that cliched feeling of being connected to everything, being one, to see ourselves more as like the organism is not me, Ellen. The organism is maybe Earth, all the humans, perhaps all the sentient beings, perhaps the whole universe, and to start to feel that being our dimensions. And so then, of course, the Ukrainian people, we are one and the same. And I even think that in the next breath, it changes our relationship to loss. And this is a tricky one. And I don't feel like I have this perfectly, I don't stand on solid footing with this, but it's something I explore in my own life, is that the more meaning I find in the vastness of the universe, in this feeling of something far beyond our comprehension happening, the less absolute loss feels to me. The more mystery to, well, what really is happening here. The more I can feel like I can connect to somebody in spirit form after I've lost them. And so I think that when it comes to anxiety, sometimes just exploring and seeking around these questions of what are the limitations of the self, what really happens when we lose somebody, I think it can sometimes take some of the pressure off the things that we can spiral and catastrophize about.
Really expanding our awareness to something bigger, and whether that's nature and connecting and feeling interconnected with nature can also really ease our anxiety, and all the research on nature and that as a treatment for anxiety as well, taking a walk in nature.
Mm.
But that's also in part because of the sense of self changes when you are in nature. You don't feel so at the center of everything. It's interesting, whether you look at it from a neuroscience perspective or a Buddhist perspective, they're all kind of pointing in the same direction. And it's kind of fascinated me to see how psychology is really and psychiatry has really picked up on psychedelics as sort of the next thing. It's very popular right now, and there's a whole protocol that they're doing. They're really trying to like nail down what is the protocol for a psychedelic treatment, where you do like a pre-treatment, and then you go in and you do the actual treatment with someone in a room with like an eye mask on and headphones on. They may hold your hand for those 3 to 6 hours of psilocybin. And then they do this integration that happens afterwards. So Western medicine has tried to take this thing and operationalize it and make it safe. And they're doing research on that right now. And these are practices that people have been doing for thousands of years with these are considered medicines. It just always fascinates me when we see probiotics in a pill. We're trying to put psychedelics in a university setting. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, for me, when it comes to psychedelics, which I'll agree are so trendy right now, I actually really invite all of these approaches. And I think, thank God we have indigenous cultures and traditional practices around this that are so reverent and so sacred. And if somebody has the option and feels comfortable going to Peru, going to Brazil, um, engaging in this way, there are parts in Africa where this is happening. That's a beautiful way to approach this medicine. It has its pros and cons. And I think the work that organizations like MAPS are doing and researchers at Johns Hopkins and UCLA and NYU, I feel sort of like, thank God that
Mm.
they're doing it in this way that will make it palatable and acceptable to the Western
Yeah.
mindset here.
Hmm.
And I think that they are doing it so wisely and so judiciously. And I think it's a really intelligent, metered approach to correcting, old moral panic around psychedelics and making sure that it happens sustainably, that they're able to actually move these medicines forward and make them accessible to more people in a safe way. So I think it's all helpful. And I just remember one time a shaman I used to work with said at the end of a ceremony, he was like, "We used to try to keep ayahuasca secret. We were
Hmm.
trying to keep it a secret in the jungle and not let it be tainted or contaminated or overexposed." And then he said, at one point, ayahuasca said to all of us, "You don't need to keep me safe. Like, I need to protect you guys." And at that point, she basically just started um, rolling out of the jungle and spreading her influence around the world. And I think perhaps just in time. And so I do think that in whatever safe and sacred and reverent way people come to these medicines, I think that when it's indicated, I think it's a really beautiful thing. And I like the fact that we're sort of omnivorous about it right now and have a
Hmm.
lot of different approaches.
And I also like how research helps us understand who it may be beneficial for and who may be actually very harmful for, because
Absolutely.
there's certainly risk factors for psychosis and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia that if you were to take these medicines and think that this is sort of the panacea, it could ruin your whole life
Yeah.
taking some of these. So that's where the research helps us understand for who and when and how much and how and get a little bit more specific about things. Yeah, I was just talking to a woman she was an intern on the last podcast that I worked on, and now she's studying MDMA for social anxiety. I would never have thought of that being possible 10 years ago, that would be so mainstream as it is now. So it's just
Yeah.
interesting to see how things have changed and perceptions have changed around it.
And I'll add one layer to your really good caveat around, for psychosis, for bipolar, there can be contraindications to these medicines. And even if you have none of those contraindications, it can excavate things that are really hard to hold. And so, whoever's coming to these medicines, I think the integration and the container afterward is of the utmost importance to be able to process it and move through what's coming up in a therapeutic setting. I think is really helpful. And I don't mean to say, this has to be under the medical model. You don't necessarily have to work with a therapist, but there needs to be a container. It could be a journaling practice, it could be processing it in an integration group, and it could be work with a therapy. But we want to integrate and galvanize the learnings from these peak experiences on the medicine, which are like the tip of the iceberg of what the work really is.
Yes, and I will say as a psychologist, I'm not recommending it to my clients until it comes out as a um, sort of this is the protocol and this is how to do it, because I err on the side of caution with all these things. So I think everyone has their comfort level of experimentation and what they recommend in their practice. Okay, so we've gone from gut microbiome to hormones to psychedelics, and your book is really like that. It really does cover a lot, and I think that's the evidence of it's not just one thing, and it's not as simple as we like to think it is when we're talking about something like anxiety. But is there any other area that you think would be helpful to mention to our listeners?
I think even that idea itself is something I want to just highlight a little bit, which is that so many patients come to me and they've got what we call like so-called functional medicine issues, like something's out of balance in their gut and there's something going on with their hormones and they're inflamed. And there's whether it's trauma or just something going on a psychospiritual plane. And, they'll say to me, like, is this problem that I'm having, is it physical or is it psychospiritual? And I guess what I'm learning over time is it really is always both. And they are interconnected. And I think it's just so helpful to recognize that there are a lot of different ways to summit the mountain of healing. And sometimes it requires taking a couple different paths. And so with my patients, sometimes there's a focus on physical healing, and then there's a shift to psychospiritual work. And sometimes then we shift back to physical healing. And there's a dance in between those two things. And I think it's just so important to recognize that. And the part that most of us overlook is the psychospiritual component to our physical ailments. It's often there.
Mhm. So for folks that want to find an integrative or holistic psychiatrist, do you have a recommendation for where they should look for that? Because you're sort of a bit of a unicorn here, you
It's
know?
it's a tricky
Yeah,
problem.
yeah.
I don't have a single answer, and everyone is a little different in terms of what they need. Sometimes I point people toward the Institute for Functional Medicine practitioner database, with the idea that there are a handful of integrative or holistic or functional psychiatrists around the country, and then word of mouth still ends up being the most effective way to find a good match, and a little bit of trialing with different people, because you do want to trust your instincts. If you meet with a practitioner and it just doesn't feel quite right, yes, that can be resistance, but I'm often here to say trust your instincts. And it's hard to find a good match. It doesn't always happen on the first try, and you're going to be investing time and money and trust, and you want to use that all wisely. So it is tricky to answer that question, but I want to encourage people, don't give up hope. There is the practitioner out there that can help you on your path.
Sometimes it's asking those questions, what are your thoughts about anxiety being related to gut health or anxiety being related to sleep? And see how your doctor answers them. Because if they get to a dead end or they can't answer some of those questions or you have better answers than they do, then maybe you need to find someone else.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking this time with us, Dr. Vora. And for those that want to check out your book, it's The Anatomy of Anxiety: Understanding and Overcoming the Body's Fear Response. And it's out March 15th. So it'll be out by the time this podcast airs. And you'll be able to spot it because it's got a cover that is easy to find in the bookstore. Hopefully, you're going to your independent bookstore to find that book as well. So it's been a delight to talk with you, and I hope that we can stay connected in other ways.
I really hope so too. Thank you so much for having me today.